I like it.
Y'all gonna find out exactly who we are.
So, a lot of entry points potentially to this conversation. Maybe let's start at the beginning. I think when we talk about divesting from patriarchy, it affects us in a lot of different ways. So maybe let's talk about what were our earliest lessons, ideas about sex, who taught us them. I know I have a lot of funny stories about when, for example, the summer entering Hampton, I was, graduated senior year. At that point in time, again, we're encouraging vulnerability, wasn't having sex, very much a virgin. I was laying on the couch, chilling, just enjoying a Saturday afternoon. My dad walks in from the garage, comes back out, throws me a pack of condoms and says, "I'm too young to be a grandfather," and walks out the room. That was like the talk.
That's it.
Wow. That was it before I went to college. And I'm just like, we can joke about it. Me and my dad joke about it now. He's like, did I really do that? I'm like, yes, sir, you did. That was our conversation. Our talk was you handing me condoms and you saying that you're too young to be a grandfather. And it's funny. And I know that was like an earlier experience about like, okay, I'm not having sex, but my dad is even noticing, okay, you're going to college, so here, get some protection. At that point in time, education was that. So that's one of my stories. What were some of y'all's earliest ideas or lessons about like what sex was, what your role as a Black man was within this very intimate, this very amazing experience? If you jog your memory, what comes to mind? I'm curious.
I'll go first.
Okay.
Simply because, like, for me, I very much just want us to take it all the way there.
Okay.
Combo. So my first
Make sure we're close to the mic too. Yeah.
My first sexual experience was around like between the ages of 3 and 5. I really can't truly remember. But it was an experience where a family member took advantage of me. Mm-hmm. And the reason I note that as my first sexual experience is because till this day, my olfactory sensor, right, my sense of smell, is continuously in line with what happened in that moment. Like I remember that moment because of the smells. Mm. And so even my sense of pleasure today is highly smell sensitive. And so why it wasn't my first like chosen time to engage in sexual activity, it was the first time I was in the presence of the energy and that thing activated, and it has been here my entire life. And so I have to give it the honor that it deserves, even though it was a traumatic experience in that sense. So that's mine.
Man, I want to say thank you for your vulnerability, sharing that.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it.
I think for me, it was just like music and like just listening to what was on the radio when I was a kid, or if I was like watching movies, the parts my parents would tell me like to close my eyes, wanting to know what I was closing my eyes for, or like what was the thing that I couldn't see at that time. And then also like when I watched like Degrassi, the episode where like Paige like was sexually assaulted and like didn't know what to do in that space, or was it her fault, or was it the complexities of what space she put herself in. But for me, it was definitely like the media. My dad didn't really like have a conversation about like consent and sex with me. It was just like, okay, if this happens, it happens. But I never knew what it was. So I like researched or tried to find out what that was. I mean, when HBO Real Sex would come on that night, that's when
I had my remote, right? And I had the
mute. What is this?
Coming down, like, let me make sure.
Right, let me
y'all had that?
Yeah, what you have?
Because I had to scramble that TV just to see if I could see something.
No, that's real. I'm trying to picture these bodies and, unscramble this blurred image. Yeah, that bring me back to cable. Yeah, all that.
Black box cable.
Yeah, all of that.
So those are my experiences of like sex, but consent was really never a conversation that was like had at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really tough because, I realize my experience is similar to a lot of Black men's experience without really talking about it. And so I appreciate Courtney sharing it a little earlier. The way I always talk about this is rape was really my first time to having conversations related to sex. So this is things, frankly, I write on a bit now related to my stepfather. And so even for me, right, when I think about what sex means now, I have to actually have a very difficult internal conversation with pleasure. Because for me, even as someone who realized I was raped at a young age, and realizing that actually I had, I ejaculated, I came, and it was some pleasurable moment in some degree. And so it really made me wrestle a lot with what sexuality meant to me, especially now as someone who identifies as openly queer, right? For the past several years, people will probably say a lifetime. But for me, for several years, the fact that I had to wrestle with, did I enjoy enjoy that moment. And what did that actually mean? Like now I know I did not, right? And then I probably knew I didn't either. There was clearly a violation, but I realized that was the first time an entry point to sex and sexuality. I should also say that I just came out with a report last week, related to sex ed in schools. And the truth is the vast majority of us have had terrible sex ed, if we've had sex ed at all. And that's certainly true when it comes to queer inclusive sex ed, right? Most of the time when we discuss sex ed, it is about, the birds and the bees, whatever the hell that's still supposed to mean.
And why.
Right? Yep. And it's really centered on straight people, right? It's like our conversations related to like heterosexual marriage as the only form of marriage, no conversations related to queer and trans people. And I was in middle school years ago and it's minimally gotten better. And that's what really like breaks my heart about it too.
I think that was like something that was interesting for me as well as being openly queer was like not seeing representation of what like sex or sexuality looked like for like when I was experiencing or exploring like what it was to be gay or like what that was. Like I think the closest thing that I like found that was like trash to me was like Queer as Folk on like HBO. It was just like white men just like having sex wherever it could be. And then that made me think about like, what is that what, I'm supposed to do? And then seeing like a healthy representation of that with Queer as Folk, Noah's Ark on Logo, that was like the contrast of like, okay, is sexuality supposed to be specifically being queer and gay? Like, am I supposed to be just very hypersexual? Am I supposed to just want this and want that versus where I see it with black men was like very romantic and just a very not a representation that you saw all the time. So that was like a thing that I was always battling with, like when I would see like straight porn or if I would see those things, I'm like, that's not, I don't know like what that looks like. I don't know what that is. Like, it was weird to me. So
yeah. And it's like it sounds like a lot of our experiences were about like really bad formal education practices when it comes to like sex and what education looks like. And then also just like our personal experiences, whether that's from family or friends telling us like, this is what you do or this is what you don't do. Yeah. And then you guys have all in some different ways talked about consent. And that's one of the, I'm glad you guys did that because I think that's one of the major things before we even talk about sex to just honor a conversation about consent. Because again, going back to stories, my dad, not that summer, but a couple summers prior when he noticed I was starting to date, said, no, you're starting to date and no means no. And I'm like, you're right.
Right.
What else? No means no. I'm like, I remember sitting in the room, my mom and my dad. I'm like, okay, I know that, but like, what are y'all talking about? Right. Yeah. And that was the extent of like my consent education. So of course, like different words like sexual assault and rape didn't even come to my vision because I just heard no means no. So like, it's really interesting having these conversations now and just kind of being able to point to certain things of like, oh, okay, that's really where it started. And appreciate y'all for also kind of making those connections because we don't have enough conversations, especially now, still in the age of Me Too, talking about like our experiences and how just consent wasn't really a part of it. We talked about like, being in school, seeing these images of like the man and the woman, but like, I don't remember hearing about consent during school ever.
Well, I would say to that point, sex and the education around it is largely centered around physical fear versus emotional love. And so everything gets taught from a perspective of like either what feels good to your body or what keeps your body safe. Yes. Where from an emotional perspective, the spectrum is much larger because when we talk about consent, what we very rarely ever hear is like, but what if the man says no and has to deal with the shame of people that then are like, oh, you ain't want that? Oh, so you just not gonna have sex? Oh, so you gonna have blue balls? And the consent wasn't even about the sex. It was about the community you had to exist in and who you had to be in order to be safe in that community based on what you were or were not doing. So those that were sexually active, those that were taking more physical advantage of their gift sexually were praised. Those that were trying to figure it out and cultivate it and understand it were like shunned. And then what does that do to you, right? It puts you in a very precarious position. And so the educational system is not designed to have that conversation by any means.
They don't want to have that conversation.
Our parents definitely weren't in a position to have that. Like I've never had any conversations with my father about sex. But my father and I have met women together and like gone out on double dates because my father is he turns 58 actually today. Happy birthday, Pop.
Hey, shout out Pops.
But being a 22-year-old father, right, when he first had me, we grew up together in a sense. And so there's been times where I'm like, Pop, don't say that. Like, we're at a table, you know, with some women, or we're out and about, and it's like, nah, tone that down. He's like, why? But that's how I feel. And it's like, no. So it's different, right? And depending upon what lens you've started from with regards to your nurturing and then what you found out to be your nature, it can get real complex if you don't have a sense of like what's leading you personally, you know?
I think immediately about power and pressure in that space of consent.
Yeah.
Like, I think of like when someone wants to consent or when somebody says no, it's the after effect that comes with like, if you say no, what can happen in that space, which is like always the like convoluted part that people are like, just say no. It's like, okay, if I say no, what happens next, right? There's physical harm that may happen. The male, which is in the most instances gets aggressive or gets like, which is toxic and like hyper masculinity in itself. But it's like, what, like, why get so like mad? You know, why do you feel like you have to be aggressive or just take it away from me? Or like the pressure is like, okay, if I say no, then it's like, why don't you want to have sex? Like, what's going on? Are you scared? Are you? It's like, no, like I just don't feel comfortable. Like this is a lot to take in. It's also, what is your relationship to sex at that time? I like can say I lost my virginity in college, you know, so I didn't know, after college. So like figuring out what sex was to me was a journey that like I like had opportunities to like have sex, but just didn't know what to do in it. It was awkward for me. It was like, do I have to do this? Do I want to do this? So it was like, I think I got so wrapped up in the conversation of power and also like pressure and seeing what consent has what it's like, just like what sex has done to people physically, like their emotional well-being, and like what we see in the media, CSI, Law and Order, SVU, like having a whole like this show is still going on, by the way. Like, so you see that there's a special victim like a series just about like rape and sexual assault, and it's like, well, like what is that? You know, like why it's like something that's very scary.
But your point really, it rings like it's a ring. I'm ringing a bell in my head because that's so real. I think about power and privilege often, and in my experience, how many people actually believe have sex and are still sexually assaulted while they're having sex because they have not been put in an environment where they feel comfortable saying no. So they say yes because of it. But their words are still no, right? Like they just actually can't express it in that way. And I do think about that also. One thing that you said, Courtney, that I think about too is like what it actually means. Like what environment are we in that we're actually allowing men to talk about why they don't want to have sex, right? Especially straight black men, right? Like I hear straight black men oftentimes talk about why they have sex, right? And the ability to have sex with multiple people, namely women, but not really anything else. Not why they may be afraid to have sex or why they don't feel comfortable with having sex. And I think that's because we live in a society, right, that has not forced those conversations because it makes you look weaker. And the last thing straight black men want to look is weak, and especially gay. Right? So I think that actually those things are additives, right, for why straight black men can't even be comfortable enough to have those conversations. And it's not just straight black men, right? Unfortunately, the same thing is true for like black queer folks and black gay folks around conversations of like, I don't want to have sex, because in some ways it is celebrated. Now, for me, I don't really have an issue with it being celebrated, but I do think we need to have this like nuance with like, what does that actually mean? If you're celebrating this, then on the other end, what are we actually pushing away?
There's no conversation about boundaries. Right. Any spectrum when you're talking about men for the most part, right? Whether it's cisgendered, queer, gay, whatever, the boundary conversation in terms of like, this is my principle, this is why I have it, it allows me to move forward, but it also denotes where I stop personally. And that becomes an environment where like when I have conversations with my gay or queer friends that are men, but that present as masculine, right? In that sense, we often have that conversation around like, so where's the intimacy in these spaces for y'all? Because you got two sometimes masculine energetics going at each other. And there can be still a lack of understanding of the emotional harmony that needs to exist between two people. And that's where for me, like the conversation, and we'll probably get into this at some point, but for me, it's why I started to explore Tantra so heavily, because it was an environment that allowed the weaving of both parts of any environment to be honored and cultivated, as opposed to having to like fix this side while I don't understand this side, or like protect this side while also making myself unsafe on this side. It's like, you know, the conversations we get into as cisgendered men around like protect black women, it's like, yeah, but what if she's doing some stupid shit to make herself unsafe? Like, am I supposed to take the bullet for her too?
I mean,
how does this work?
I think I would push back in the sense that yes, we all make decisions, but I think if we're, especially in terms of divesting from patriarchy, just looking at the entire system of like, yeah, there are Black women who do buy into patriarchy and that might harm themselves and us as well. But I think the power structure is still like male dominant.
Yeah.
And I think that's
Always.
what causes like some conversations where it's like, you know, she did this thing. And it's like, yeah, she harmed you. Yeah. I think when we talk about sex, you guys have all mentioned it in certain ways, how coming back to this conversation about patriarchy, how it just takes us out of our bodies.
Absolutely.
We're not supposed to